Hello, viewers around the world, and welcome to another session of Luohan On The Air. I'm your trusty moderator, Cheng Lei. Usually I anchor the biz shows on CGTN, and today we're going to talk about Pandemonics, mechanism design and COVID recovery. And as a parent, I'm so looking forward to having children back because it's been 4.5 months of this pandemic, all these worrying tallies. We're almost desensitized to it, GDP crashing, and massive stimulus by governments. How do we design policies that really work? Well, here's somebody who won a Nobel Prize for that. Professor Eric Maskin joining us from Boston, Nobel laureate for economics, and from Hangzhou, of course, Professor Chen Long, who is the executive director at Luohan Academy. Welcome to our discussion, gentlemen. So let me start by asking you, Eric, we've seen this flurry of monetary and fiscal stimulus from governments, but the common issue around the world is that it's very hard to help small business. From a mechanism design point of view, can you shed some light on how to better reach SMEs?
Well, in the United States, I think a mistake was made in giving fiscal relief a little too broadly. That is, I think it would have been a better use of the money to focus it more on small and medium-sized enterprises and not so much on big companies. Big companies have far more staying power. They have many more resources that they can draw upon besides the governments, and
they also have more lobbyists.
They also have more lobbyists. So I think that in this period that the U.S. is going through, where very difficult for many businesses to operate as usual, it's imperative that we give some breathing room to the small and medium-sized companies who, without this essential help, may disappear altogether. That isn't to say that large companies won't face stresses. Of course they will, but they're better able to get through this this transition period than the smaller enterprises.
So you would have had a more targeted fiscal bailout program for SMEs.
Right.
And what about corporate tax reform? This is something else that people have been calling for.
Well, we already had quite a lot of corporate tax reform. The major tax acts of the Trump administration cut the corporate tax rates quite significantly, as well as doing many other tax shifting things. Again, I would have preferred the tax relief in that bill to have been better targeted. It's the large corporations don't need it so much. The small corporations and the small enterprises do.
Is this something you agree with, Professor Chen? And how do you define, small and large, or how should you define?
But let me start by saying that there are indeed many ways to get to the SMEs, and that is being adopted across the world. For example, in Europe, and both in Europe and US, they have this salary protection program. So essentially, the governments, the central banks, encourage the banks to lend the SMEs, and so that they do not to let fire people. And actually, for another example, is you can cut interest rate. If you cut interest rate, then actually the borrowing rate is going down. You can also delay the tax payment, or you can just send money directly to the families. So I guess there are many ways to do this. And if you look at, for example, in China, so that's a little bit different. And in China, because it's more digitized, so actually we have a lot of access to SMEs. So you can directly send money to SMEs. So for example, for Alipay, we actually will work with a lot of the banks. So to provide the lending directly to a lot of SMEs, because you have this connectivity through the digital technology. And in China, we also have this something called consumption coupon. So have tens of billions of dollars. So that essentially encourages the consumers to spend, because when the consumers spend, actually it benefits a lot of the SMEs, because SMEs tends to be in the service industries. But let me come back to echo with what Eric said. So I think that we know the pandemic is this so-called distancing economy, and it's really SMEs that are hurt more because it tends to be in the more contact-related, labor-intensive industries. So they tends to be more affected by the distancing. So I echo with Eric's point that especially the SMEs, they need more support, proportionally much more than the bigger companies.
But what about things like airlines that are absolutely decimated? They're big companies, Eric.
They are, but I don't think that it's essential that Delta Airlines, say, or United Airlines be preserved. Once the pandemic is over and people are flying around the world again, the airplanes will still be there. It's not essential that the particular companies that are running those airplanes, flying those airplanes, are there too. They can be reorganized. So it wouldn't be a disaster if we had a bankruptcy or two when it came to airlines. But when certain small businesses disappear, restaurants say, they're gone for good. They're not going to be replaced by another restaurant right away. So I think it's much more important that we preserve our small and medium-sized businesses than the big ones.
And staying with the subject of designing the stimulus, we've seen the US government basically hand out helicopter money to American families. But could that disincentivize some families or people from finding work? I mean, how do you avoid the side effects?
Well, so normally you worry when you hand out money to unemployed people that perhaps you're stopping them from taking jobs. At the moment, there aren't any jobs to take, and so it's not that people are sitting back idly. That most people would love to be able to work, but their jobs aren't operational. So it's essential that we keep those people going, that we give them enough money to live on until the jobs come back. And once the jobs come back, well, then we can start worrying about whether we're disincentivizing people. But it's too soon, at least in the US, to worry about that.
And what about you, Professor Chen? What would you do?
Sir, what's the question again?
If you had to avoid the side effects of helicopter money, which may disincentivize job seekers?
I think it's because a major problem of the pandemic economy is the liquidity problem. So I think it's like as if somebody is, you just have to, you cannot breathe and for some time. So it's like a nightmare, let me put it this way. And so what we hope for is that when you wake up, your body still functions. So I think it's crucial to remain the health of your body and whatever you can do. So that's why we see that this time a lot of this the helicopter money or this other support is unprecedented. But the point here is clear. It's not because of the economic problems. It's actually a temporary shock. We're hoping that after several quarters, the companies, the institutions are still there because the replacement cost is very high. So I think because of that, it's meaningful. It's to try, but there must be some problems. I think the side effect of that. But I think we can somehow, compared to the benefits, keep them alive. I think it's probably worthwhile.
Eric, you mentioned that the stimulus in the US might be too broad. What are your other comments on how the US has handled both the pandemic and trying to engineer a recovery from a mechanism design point of view? I mean, what would you have done differently?
Well, the major failure in the United States was not in the realm of economic policy, although I have some quarrels with the way that fiscal relief was given. I think the fact that it was large and the fact that many people were helped was a good thing. The big failure in the US was in their response to the disease itself. And their government could have done a lot more. First, in recognizing that this was a serious problem and to take action early to isolate people. That was not done. But then once the disease was here and once the disease was widespread, what the government should have done was to ramp up its testing program, ramp up protective equipment, particularly masks, and ramp up a medical response. And although all of those things have been done finally to some extent, it was very, very late. So much so that the United States, I'm afraid, now has the record for the worst pandemic response of all of the highly developed countries of the world.
And do you want to elaborate on the quarrels that you have with the fiscal stimulus, aside from not helping SMEs?
Well, that's my main complaint. Well,
okay.
Let me mention one other thing, which is that there was one large infusion of cash that was already made, in which people with low incomes received some money to help them get through. But now there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there's going to be continued support from the government. That I think is very unfortunate. I think there should be continued support from the government because the economy has not yet recovered, and the government should be promising to continue to give people relief as long as the economy is operating well below capacity. And the government has not promised to do that, and that's contributed to misery among people at the bottom.
And Professor Chen, last time we spoke, at one of these sessions, it was about the PET, your tracker, which uses mobility data from around the world. How do you evaluate, the effectiveness of policies on both the economy and virus containment?
Firstly, let me come back to your earlier question. That is how to alleviate the side effect of the helicopter money. Actually, I think China's approach is worthy to recommend. That is to provide the digital consumption coupon. Because there are a couple of problems with the helicopter money. One is that this could be too much. And another thing is that a lot of time people turn that into the savings. They don't spend it. If they don't spend it, they don't help the companies. But if it is a consumption coupon, so essentially you have to spend it
within a certain amount of time.
Yeah. Exactly, and then that helps the companies, so SMEs, especially SMEs. So I think that's one way to deal with it. Now let me come back to the next question. That is how do we evaluate the performance of the governments? And I do agree with what Eric said. Is that it's kind of amazing if we think back to think about the large variations how the government responds to this crisis. And if you think about China, the lockdown of Wuhan on January 23rd, it was probably considered an early milestone because it was kind of unprecedented in the modern Chinese history to lock down a city with more than 10 million people. But actually, if you think about it in retrospective, the case at that time was very mild because altogether on January 23rd, there were only 571 confirmed cases. And altogether, China had a bit more than 80,000 cases. Right now, it's less than 3% of the United States. So what I'm trying to say is that it's kind of, and I agree, it's not a medical capacity or the power. It's really how the government responds to it. In general, it's been in the United States, I think in many, actually both in Europe and the United States, especially in the United States, it's too late. So if we look at some numbers, on average, there's about 10 people dead out of a million people in Asia because of the pandemic. 255 dead in Europe out of a million people, and 367 dead in North America, and 177 thus far in Latin America. So unfortunately, North America right now leads the world in terms of the deaths per million people. So I think it was reacting too late. Then it was it's trying to resume the economy too fast. So if you look at the United States right now, the two types of the states in the United States. If you look at the states that reopened their economy before May 10th, on average, you see the big rise, exponential rise of the new confirmed cases. But for the states that opened after May 10th, which is about half of the states in the United States, actually, it remains the new confirmed cases remains going down. So some of the states in the United States, like for example Florida, so it acts pretty much like the third wave countries, developing countries. So you can see that the government response really matters. And what we really see from the data across the world is that the speed really matters because not doing anything is not really an option. But so the governments it's possible the governments tends to not do much. They're hoping that it will not hurt the economy. But unfortunately, it's not an option. So if you react quickly, like in some of the East Asian countries, or even in the third wave countries, for example, like Vietnam, actually you can contain both the pandemic and economic loss at very little cost. It can recover faster. It's so the faster you do, actually, the less loss you suffer. But the country.
But would you agree that in some cities in China, for example, Beijing, where I am, the government has gone the other way, the other extreme, easing very, very slowly at the expense of a lot of business. People are getting depressed, killing themselves. What do you make of that?
I think we are still trying to learn to live with the pandemic. So initially, we are trying to delay the response. Then we realize that it's unavoidable. Then we see the lockdowns across the world. Now we resume the economy. Now we see that it's possible, even in the case of China, the pandemic could come back in spots. And at that time, we need to learn to live with it. It's not a 0 or 1 choice, but maybe somewhere in between. So that's the tough part. But I think we're learning the lessons.
But zero tolerance is not going to be a viable way going forward, right? That's just going to kill economies. Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Zero
Eric,
tolerance.
do you want to come in on this?
Could I just follow up on that?
Sure.
One thing that the United States has been lacking is a targeted approach to the virus. Instead, it's been general lockdown. That's what happened in New York. That's what happened in Boston. Now it's happening in Texas for the second time. And the reason why this general rather than targeted approach is necessary is that we're not testing people to see whether they actually have the virus. If we were giving people tests on a weekly or even twice a week basis, we would know who has to be isolated and who doesn't. And the people who don't have the virus can safely go back to work. That, I think, is the single greatest failing in the American policy. Given the circumstances, yes, they had to have lockdown, but if they had only reacted quickly on the testing front, that lockdown could have been much more targeted.
And is that a result of politics or inadequate testing kits?
No, it's a result of poor leadership. I'm afraid that at the federal level, we have the poorest leadership that has occurred in my lifetime at the moment. The federal government is really a disgrace. Now, I'm quite hopeful that things will be improved via the election in November. Things are looking better and better on that front, but November is still a long time off, and a lot of damage can be done in the meantime. All of these problems could have been solved had there been adequate leadership at the top.
And are mechanisms designed for public goods such as test kits and vaccines? Because we know that in a pandemic, it's hard to find the market working efficiently to price goods efficiently. So, if you have very big buyers and sellers, that might make the market uncompetitive. What's your solution to this challenge?
Again, the governments could, and I hope still will, step in. And we know how to create mechanisms in which suppliers of test kits, suppliers of protective equipment have the incentive to produce at the socially optimal level. These mechanisms have been known for many years now, but to be implemented, they require a buyer big enough and rich enough to pay the price for ramping up supply. Now, the federal government can do that. If the federal government had set aside $100 billion or $200 billion to produce tens of thousands of test kits, and then redistributed those test kits to citizens at very low prices, everyone could have been tested. No one would have been bankrupted by having to pay for test kits, and we could have had an adequate supply. So the key to get mechanism design into the act is for the government to play the role of the big buyer, and then to redistribute the products, the test kits, the protective equipment, the medicine at low prices.
Do you think this is something that would happen in China, Professor Chen?
Yeah, I think so. I think to deal with we need to have the right mechanism to make good use of the vaccine. Firstly, we should have the right perception that unless everybody is safe, the rest of the world is safe, then you are not safe. I think we're learning that from this. Then we need to have the right mechanism. For example, we should have the World Health Organization or some other bodies that set the standards and safety of the vaccines to be developed. Then we need to have a set of the financial and medical support mechanisms, such as the World Bank or other institutions, to help to reach to the especially low-income regions and people. We also need to have multiple parties actually to track the gap, the lack of vaccine globally in different countries and regions. So we need to help each other. So a lot of things can be done, but we particularly need the mechanism and especially the leadership to do that.
And Eric, how would the distribution of vaccines, once we have them, how would that relate to your research on social choice?
Well, that vaccine, as you were suggesting, and Long was emphasizing, a vaccine should be thought of as a public good. If I take it, that's not just good for me; it's good for everyone. And right. So it's very important to know from basic economic theory that public goods are not going to be supplied at a high enough level through the market alone. It's very important that a mechanism, a government mechanism, be created to make sure that everyone gets the vaccine. And again, government can play two roles when it comes to vaccines. First, by giving drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, sufficient incentive to develop the vaccine by, say, guaranteeing them a high reward if they develop a successful vaccine. That's the first step. But then once the vaccine is developed, it's important that government be willing to buy it and then distribute it at low cost to citizens so that essentially everybody gets the vaccine without having to pay, without have to pay their life savings in order to obtain it. Those are the two critical roles that government should play. There are various ways of doing this. One way is for the government simply to announce in advance, if you develop a successful vaccine, and they can define what that would mean, then you get such and such a reward. Another way is simply to subsidize research, use a market solution, but with subsidies to make sure that the drug companies have sufficient incentive to develop a vaccine quickly. Either method could be a success, and either method would be preferable to what we have now, where yes, we have a we have a number of successful candidates for vaccines, but in my view, there should be even more activity in that direction. I believe there's something like 4 vaccines in phase 3 trials in the US. That's better than nothing, but it'd be better still if we had a dozen vaccines in phase 3 trials.
Sure. And what about the role of, I mean, does the government have to have the biggest role? Can a digital platform big enough also help in setting prices and have its role in mechanism design?
Digital platforms can help facilitate transactions, but no, in the end, it has to be governments playing the role of providing public goods. That's why they're called public goods, because they are provided publicly, and it's the government who is acting. That the government is the institution that acts on behalf of the public, on behalf of the entire society. We don't have any other institution that does that.
So Chen, do you agree? I mean, what about in China, where sometimes digital platforms carry out, tasks for the government, like the consumer coupons?
Yeah, I think the reality is probably somewhere in between. So I do agree that there's a limit, because you cannot really expect the companies, including big companies, actually to do the public good. But on the other hand, because of nowadays the digital platforms, they are actually, for example, marketplaces. They actually, it's not just a company; it's a combination of a market and a company. Company is just operator of the market, and so in that sense, then the company a lot of time could realize that it shoulders part of the governance, public governance issues. It should help the public. Because it's to the benefit. If you help the public, it's helping the company too. Especially on the digital platform. That's why you see more companies. I think at least in China, I believe in other countries too, they're much more willing. The platforms much more willing to help, to facilitate all the resources to help to deal with the pandemic, as we have observed in the past half year or so. So I think that. It's much better than before. It's probably, but I do agree with Eric that the government should the ultimate responsibility. But that governance issue, that responsibility shared more by different institutions nowadays across the world.
Eric, yeah.
Can I just add to that? So of course it's wonderful when private companies behave in a publicly responsible way. I'm all for that. But my point is we can't rely on that alone, because ultimately businesses are in business to make a profit. That is the number one goal of a business. It may have other goals as well, but the first responsibility is to make a profit, and therefore, however public spirited companies might potentially be, we will always need government doing a lot of the heavy work in getting a public good produced.
But
Okay,
let
so
me add on.
Mhm.
May I add on a little bit to this?
Sure.
But I think the spirit of the corporation is changing these days, because there's especially with the help of the technology, there's more coordination across between the consumers and the producers, and a lot of more coordinations. In that sense, I think that's precisely, I believe, why we have raised the issue of the corporate social responsibility, because it was discussed much less before. So I think the spirit is to encourage such collaboration, to help each other. So that's then, according to this, we also see the shouldering the responsibility much more. But I do agree with Eric that ultimately the government has to be the last resort, and to really to be responsible for the whole thing, even though it should get more help these days from the companies and the platforms.
Okay, so right now, the US and China are leading in vaccine development. Once they're ready to be deployed, how should the global governance organizations help distribute, vaccines between the countries that are leading now and the developing countries that don't have the medical capacity? Eric?
Well, I think it's critical that once we have effective vaccines, that they be distributed throughout the world at zero or very low cost. Very poor countries should get these vaccines for essentially nothing. And institutions like the World Bank, like the United Nations, as well as the leading economies of the world, like the US and China, should bear the lion's share of the cost of disseminating these vaccines. I should say that in producing a vaccine, in developing a vaccine, the biggest cost is incurred before the vaccine is actually created. Once it's there, ramping up production is a small fraction of the development costs. So there's really no excuse for not making the vaccine available on a worldwide basis once the vaccine exists, because the cost of doing so is so small relative to the development cost.
But aren't we going to see a bit of a squabble between the richer countries that have subsidized or helped pharma companies with getting the vaccine? And then, how do you distribute it? It's how do you share the burden? What's the mechanism?
Well, Long and I have already pointed out that for any of us to feel safe,
Everyone must be safe.
it has to be the case that everyone in the world, or essentially everyone in the world, has to be free of the virus, because it's not enough for people in China and the US to be vaccinated. If people in Latin America or people in Africa are not vaccinated, sooner or later, it's going to come back to bite us. And we live in a very much a globalized world, and so it's not just in our altruistic interest to make sure that the vaccine is distributed globally. It's in our self-interest to make sure that it's distributed globally. It is good for us. So again, government, and I think government here must again play the leading role. Government must ensure that the vaccine gets a global distribution, and it can do that by making sure that the vaccine producers get whatever money it takes to give them the incentive to produce the vaccines. But then once the vaccines are produced, they are sold to poor countries at a far lower price, or even a zero price.
Professor Chen, I mean, I have 2 kids. If I told them to give something to another child, they would say, why doesn't he do it? Why doesn't she do it? Would that happen?
Well, that's precisely why the pandemic is a big test on the global governance and especially leadership.
And we're failing.
Exactly. That's precisely what we're hoping they don't fail, because it's to everybody's interest. If you want to protect yourself, you have to help other people. But so what Eric said is absolutely correct. But we've been failing so many times, so that I won't be surprised if there's more cobble ahead related to this.
Eric, you wrote papers and developed a model with another prize winner, Michael Kramer. You explained why comparative advantage and international cooperation may not make African countries and emerging economies rich. So before the outbreak of the pandemic, what went wrong with globalization?
Well, let me slightly
address the earlier point. Yep.
Say, globalization is in fact a very powerful engine for allowing developing countries to get rich. That's how China got rich. That's how India got rich. Both countries still have a long way to go, but they've come as far as they have precisely because of globalization. I'm all in favor of using the powerful engine of globalization to help make African countries rich too. But the problem with globalization is that it does come at a cost, which is that the benefits of globalization is not equally distributed. It tends to be people with skills who can offer something to global markets who get most of the benefit from globalization. People without skills, people at the bottom, people with no education get left behind. And so within a country, globalization tends to increase inequality, particularly in developing countries. So the country as a whole gets richer, that's good, but inequality in that country grows. And that
what about between countries?
In the last 30 or 40 years, we have seen a decrease in inequality across countries, and globalization has had a lot to do with that. That's a good thing too. So globalization has tended to increase inequality within countries, but decrease inequality across countries. In my view, and in Michael Kramer's, in my view, there is that what I was just saying is not an argument against globalization, the fact that it increases within country global inequality, because that inequality can be counteracted by policy. For example, job training. To counteract inequality. Education is a way to counteract inequality. As long as a country is willing to make those investments, it can have the benefits of globalization without the costs.
Do you want to comment on the globalization issue, Professor Chen?
Yeah, I think that as Eric said, globalization has been a great engine for the development of the developing countries, but it does have some problems, especially probably for some quite big time that the bigger companies benefit more from it. But I think that can be, so that's some of the issue with the trade. But I think, so that has been the issue actually globally in the past hundreds of years of history. If we can see that for some time, that then the globalization will be kind of in retreat for some time because there will the growing resistance to that. And I think that has been the case even before the pandemic. And the pandemic is actually somehow making this worse because it's people will feel like more safer because there's a lot of disruption to the supply chain, and they also feel safer, strategically safer if they can produce things within or this or that. So I think that's a further disturbance to the globalization. But on the other hand, I think remains a huge hope and a lot of the benefits for globalization. And I think a lot of issues could be fixed in some way. Now, just now, Eric mentioned one way for example, training. But let me bring up another thing that is technology. So if you remember, Alibaba's actually the mission is to let trade be easy everywhere in the world. So that is how Alibaba was established back in 1999. It was using the digital technology to help the people to trade on the digital platform. As you know, every Chinese know in China on Taobao, it was meant for the small business. So I think now with the technology, it is much more possible for very small companies to serve people 10,000 kilometers away. And it was impossible in the traditional industrial world. It has to be big companies to do that. Nowadays, it's much more possible even for SMEs. So I think there's problems with the globalization, but I think there's there's still a lot of the potential and the ways to fix it, especially with the aid of the technology. So in our observation, actually, also the trade is still going on quite a bit. For example, if we look at the data on the digital platform cross-border trades, actually in the beginning of the pandemic period, then there's a lot of trade, for example, for the masks, for a lot of the medical equipment. Then there's a huge demand for those indoor at-home activity and entertainment stuff, supplies. Now there's a lot of the demand for the resuming of the economy. So you can see that there's a lot of the demand across the world. So on the one hand, we see the disruptions of the supply chains. On the other hand, we see a lot of the new opportunities coming up, a lot of new demand. So I think there's there's a lot of challenge, and there are technologies, there are ways to fix this. As also there's a lot of opportunities.
Can I
Eric,
just add?
Yeah.
Can I add something to what Long said? One very important point that he made was the role of technology in globalization, and I completely agree with that. In fact, the globalization that we're living in now is completely different from the globalizations that have happened in the past. This is not the first globalization. There have been several periods. For example, in the late 19th century, there was a period in which trade between North America and Europe ramped up dramatically. That was also a period of globalization. But what is different about this globalization is technology, and the fact that technology has brought the production process, has made the production process itself global. There are many, many goods which are in effect internationally produced. Computers might be designed in the US and programmed in Europe and then manufactured in Asia. And that's true of thousands of goods. And as technology develops further, that is going to make the possibility of globalization even better. So this is precisely the wrong time in human history to be turning away from globalization. As technology continues to improve, and it will improve, we should be globalizing even more.
And Eric, within country, poor people tend to suffer more from COVID-19, and poorer countries also tend to suffer more. So is rising global inequality inevitable? What do we do?
Well, as we were discussing a few minutes ago, the gap between poor countries and rich countries has actually been getting smaller over the last 20, 30, 40 years. That is being set back temporarily by COVID, but I think that is just a temporary setback. And once we've got through this pandemic, I expect, as long as countries continue to be willing to harness the engine of globalization, that poorer countries will continue to catch up. Look, it's easier to catch up if you're behind than it is to move ahead if you're on the frontier, because to catch up, all you have to do is to adapt technology that has already been developed. That's all you need to grow. If you're at the frontier, it's harder to grow as quickly because you have to develop new technology to take you the next step further.
Professor Chen, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think on this issue, the government's response is crucial because what we have seen is that in the second wave, the affected countries are the developed world from Europe and North America, and thus far they've been suffering the most deaths, and there's a lot of the economic setback. So the advanced countries didn't really perform very well thus far. But what is really worrisome are the third wave countries. I mean, the countries hit by the third wave of the pandemic. Those are the African countries, some Latin American countries, and also some of the Asian countries, because they do not have the capacity to test, to track, and isolate the cases to deal with the pandemic itself, nor could they resist the economic losses. So those are the countries that could probably the ones you are worried about. So I think, but they're the governments, but there's so much we can learn. As a Chinese, we just feel so dismayed and disappointed that the lessons that suffered from the first wave of the country, East Asian countries, it was not taken up seriously. And so Europe and America really suffer from this. But we're really hoping that we should help the third wave countries, because a lot of them are the developing countries, and they will be really hurt more. And nor do they have the enough ability to deal with this. So we really need to help them on both the pandemic and economy side to help them to get through this crisis.
Eric, do you think the pandemic will reshape globalization? And if so, what's a productive direction to go in? We've been talking a lot about so-called globalization or regionalization or localization of say, some health supply production.
I think it would be a mistake if we concluded from the pandemic that producing everything locally or regionally is a good idea. Yes, the pandemic has shown that supply chains can be disrupted, but the answer to that problem is not to produce everything locally or regionally, but rather to have multiple supply chains. Keep them global, but make sure that you have an insurance policy and you're not relying on only one source for your supplies. An investor who is starting out is always told that the secret to good investing is to have a diversified portfolio. The same thing holds true when it comes to choosing your suppliers. You don't want to have just a single supplier. You want to insure yourself against disruption. That doesn't mean avoiding globalization. It just means diversifying a little bit. So yes, I think there is a risk that we will step back from globalization because of the pandemic, but that's only because I think there's a danger that we will draw the wrong lessons from this experience. The right lesson is to diversify, not to regionalize.
Okay. Just now we were talking about the lack of quality leadership in the US that may be changed by the election. I know, Eric, you're an expert on voting theory and you've been working on strategic voting. And last year, you and Larry Summers proposed a ranked choice voting in Massachusetts, which could eliminate the so-called spoiler effect. Can you just elaborate for our viewers what all that means? And also, how is technology going to play a bigger role in the upcoming election?
Well, first of all, the United States, in most places, uses what is called plurality rule, or first past the post voting, to elect public officials. That means that if there's a particular office to be filled and there are several candidates, each voter votes for one candidate and whoever gets the most votes is elected. And the reason why that's a problem, why this is not a good voting system, is that if there are 3 or more candidates, it's possible that well, let's take the example where there are exactly 3. So suppose there are 3 candidates, A, B, and C. Let's imagine that candidates A and B are actually quite similar, and C is very different. Well, what might happen is that A and B might split a big fraction of the votes. Maybe there's 60% of the people who like A and B, but 30% vote for A, 30% vote for B. So that means that candidate C, who gets 40%, is elected, but A and B are actually each
the more popular choice. Yeah.
That most people prefer either A or B to C. That by the way, is how Donald Trump got elected president. He was nominated by the Republican Party. Most Republicans were ordinary. Most Republican candidates were ordinary, sensible Republicans, and they split the vote, and that allowed Donald Trump, who was a very different sort of candidate, to win, even though he did not have a majority of the vote. But he had very far from a majority of the vote. So as you say, Larry Summers and I have proposed to move to ranked choice voting, in which voters can do more than just vote for one candidate. They can rank the candidates. So if A, B, and C are running, I can have the ranking A, B, C, or maybe the ranking B, A, C, but I can put both A and B above C as a voter. I don't have to choose one or the other. I can put both of them ahead of C, and that way we don't have a vote splitting problem anymore. We don't have a spoiler effect anymore. And as you mentioned, Massachusetts is likely to adopt ranked choice voting in November. Now, you asked about the role of technology in elections. The way that we were able to get ranked choice voting onto the ballots was because of technology. It is now possible to sign a petition electronically. And in the midst of a pandemic, that's the only way that people can express themselves. You can't ask them to go out to a public place and physically sign the petition. That would be too dangerous. So we got the court to allow electronic signatures for petitions, and this was essential for getting ranked choice voting on the ballots this coming November. I expect as the years go by, we're going to see much more and more use of technology in elections. In fact, ultimately, I expect that people will actually vote online. We can't do that yet. There are too many security problems to do that yet, but eventually, I'm sure the technology will improve enough so that people will be able to vote safely and securely in their own home. And this will happen.
Professor Chen, what do you think of that? You used to live in the States.
I think I agree with Eric. I think it's the technology. Firstly, there's a problems, mechanism design problems with the voting, and I also believe that the technology can help to alleviate that situation. So I have nothing to add on this.
All right. So what about how digital technology can help in contract enforcement and policy implementation? You know, better tracking, better targeting, better monitoring.
Ask me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think following what Eric just said, actually, especially digital technology is meant to overcome the distance. So now we're talking about the distance economy, but in China or across the world, we have learned that the digital technology is it overcomes this problems. So I think that the key is the digital identity, because when distancing, we actually do not know each other, or do not know each other's situation, or do not trust each other. But actually, digital technology help us to, as if we look at each other. But let me give you one concrete example. So we know in China, probably more than 1 billion people are using the mobile payment. But I think so China in that sense is the most advanced country in terms of mobile payment use in the world. But I think few people realize that that's because the mobile payment is much safer than traditional bank cards. Why is that case? Because when I'm using the bank cards, let's say somebody is swiping the card. You have no idea, is it somebody or is this guy's a dog or somebody else? Because you don't see it. But nowadays, when I'm using the mobile payment, using your phone, we know precisely who is using that. Does this guy has enough money in his account? Is this guy swiping the card under normal circumstances? You have so much more information. So it actually has become much safer. So I've never seen a single person in my real life that had problem with the digital payment in my life. But obviously, we have some problem. Many of us have some problem with credit card problems. So that's how technology has helped us. So, and the key here, as I said, is the digital identity, because the digital technology make as if we have an identity, as if we see each other, as if 1 billion people see each other in the marketplace. They can treat to each other, they see each other, and they actually can rate each other. For the companies, for individuals, So to build trust. So that's how it does. And that also happens in nowadays, actually, when we deal with the pandemic. Now you see in China, we use the health QR code everywhere. Well, not that is, but that helps because in order to resume the economy, we have to trust each other. We have to track the cases. It cannot be a 0 or 1 cases. So if to do that effectively, we have to be able to identify who's relatively more healthy, who needs protection, this or that. And so in that case, then technology helps a lot. Of course, we also, in the meantime, we have to have enough protection of the privacy. But otherwise, digital technology help to overcome the challenge of the of distance.
Do you want to comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree with Long that digital technology can play an important role in helping to forge better trust between people who are doing business with one another, even if they're separated by huge distances. But another thing that digital technology can do is to make sure that information that we want to keep private is not spread any more than we want. And let me give you a specific example. I've been involved in the United States in some huge auctions of radio spectrum. The United States and many other countries too have promoted the telecom revolution by transferring large portions of the radio spectrum from the public sector to the private sector, to telecom companies who use this radio spectrum for mobile telephones and for satellite TV and for everything else. Now, if I'm a telecom company and you're a telecom company, if I'm bidding in the auction, I may not want you to know what I've bid, because that gives you insights into my business. And since we're competitors, I would prefer to keep that information private. In a traditional auction, it's very difficult to keep your bid private, but digital technology allows us all to make bids for radio spectrum and for a winner to be determined and for people to verify that they were the winner or not the winner without releasing all the details of the bids. It can be done cryptographically. And that kind of cryptographic auction, I think, is the wave of the future. I think all sorts of transactions will be processed through cryptography to keep what should be kept private. That will help protect privacy, and it will also promote more willingness to engage in these big transactions.
But
and
so let me add on a little bit. So yes, now this actually, let me give the example of the blockchain. So actually blockchains make it hard to change the information. So that makes the information trustworthy. So and in the meantime, it can add keys such that this information can be private. So only the part that needs to be public will be public. So there are many ways to actually turn on and off the technology, the information to help because human society has benefited tremendously from the flow of the data, of the information, exchange of the information. But in the meantime, it also create more problems with the privacy issues. So technology can also be used to mitigate that problem. And let me go back to the issue I just talked about earlier, the health QR code. It could be turned on to be used at a crisis period. But after that period, it will be phased out. So you can turn on and off of those kind of information. So technology can be used in many ways.
Eric, since COVID-19, I've seen two types of business stories on my shows. One is about how because there's less economic activity, the environment is actually breathing a sigh of relief. Another type of story that I'm seeing is because people are so keen to restart the economy, any previous thoughts about going green, about sustainability have gone out the window. So how do we design mechanisms to speed up this green transition and fix our economies?
Well, in fact, what you're talking about was foreshadowed in the previous recession. If we go back to the recession of 2008, 2009, which was a very serious recession also, we did see a temporary reprieve when it came to greenhouse gas emissions. Then, as now, we saw a dramatic fall in carbon emissions. And that was a good thing. And we saw the air quality in many cities improve significantly. And that was a good thing. But the danger is when the economy is already well into recovery. That's when we may be tempted to say, let's relax environmental regulations for the sake of completing the recovery. That I think would be a mistake. And that mistake was made 10 years ago, and I hope that it's not repeated this time around. What we have to do at the moment, we don't have to worry too much, but a year or two from now, when as I hope we're well into recovery, that is the time to remember that our long-term viability depends on preserving the environment, and any short-term gain we get by damaging the environment is only going to be that. It's only going to be a short-term gain. We're going to pay for it in the long run.
Professor Chen, do you think we are going to becoming more sustainability minded as a result of the pandemic, or are we going backwards?
Well, I'm not. If we are in the rational sense, we should believe that we should be more
That's a big if.
Sustainability minded. But I'm reminded by history that they might not be the case at all. So pandemic is actually very similar to the environmental challenges in the sense that unless we collaborate to deal with it, in the end, everyone will suffer. So because environment issues, the pollution issues, the air, it travels across the world, and so it creates all kinds of disasters. So we just have to collaborate. So in such a moment, then the lack of leadership it will be a huge problem. Unfortunately, globally, when we have to collaborate, the lack of leadership usually show up repeatedly, like what we see this time. But I do think, and I believe a lot more people are thinking this is like tells what will happen if there's a huge environmental challenge, catastrophe come. So it helps us prepare for this. And so after this, the pandemic economy, after the pandemic is disentangled from the economy, becomes much back to normal, we have to think more about the mechanism to deal with this kind of the challenge. That is a big test on our governance issues, on our collaboration issues to deal with it.
Eric, you had a few papers on sustainability. How does the pandemic change our sustainability strategies?
I don't think it changes. It changes them at all. As Luohan was saying, the pandemic.
I mean, what if people buy more cars? What if people, live in bigger houses just to be distanced?
Oh, but I don't think. I don't think people believe that buying a bigger house is going to protect them from the coronavirus, and buying a bigger car is not going to help either. As far as global warming goes, the main effect of the pandemic is to postpone the seriousness of the crisis temporarily, because production is down, industry is down, travel is down. We're not polluting as much now as we normally would be, but we're going to come back to normal within a year or two, and that's the point at which we have to remember that there's a global warming problem to deal with. The pandemic should remind us of that, because as Luohan was saying, to cure the pandemic, we have to collaborate in the same way we're going to have to collaborate to cure the global warming problem. It's the same sort of cooperation across countries that is called for. These are public goods. The biggest problems the world faces today are all public good problems, goods which cannot be solved by markets alone. They can only be solved by cooperation at the government level. Environment, pandemic, energy, all of those should be testing tens of millions a day, so that we can take a targeted approach to who should be isolated and who can go back to work safely. That is the single biggest priority for the US. And to do that, we need mechanism designed to make sure that we have adequate supply at an affordable price.
Professor Chen?
So I think the fitting today's theme, the problem of the pandemic is that we think we act individually at the individual level or the country or region level, but actually we suffer collectively. So mechanism-wise, we just have to collaborate with each other. But the lesson so far, the biggest lesson so far is that we're not really helping each other. We do not learn from each other, and we do not help each other. And that's why we've had at least three waves of the pandemic. It's getting worse and worse. And so later waves happens as if the previous waves didn't happen before. So we didn't learn from each other enough. And nor do we help each other. But then, so that remains a big test to the global community. And I believe that the priority is still to share the lessons and experience and to help each other. I think the biggest problem nowadays, and is looming bigger, it's the third wave countries that lacks both the ability to test, to track or isolate the cases, nor could they sustain the economic losses. And what can they do? And if they are not safe, nobody is safe. We'll help them on both fronts.
Great stuff. So let me just recap. I think the big keyword I got out of Eric today was targeted. He's calling for more targeted fiscal relief focused on small and medium-sized companies because they would really disappear if not helped. He's calling for more targeted testing, ramped up testing, so that you can have easing of lockdowns and not a spike in coronavirus, as well as more targeted initiatives to ensure adequate supply of medical equipment and vaccines at an acceptable price. Whereas I think the big words I got out of Professor Chen were technology and collaboration. If we don't learn from our mistakes and help each other, we're just going to keep the cycle of misery. Some of the other things we talked about, globalization, how it does create more inequality within country if there is no proper job training and investments in technology. But Eric believes that saying no to globalization is the wrong way, and you should just be having more insurance in your supply chains with diversification. And on voting, we'll be looking forward to seeing the results of ranked choice voting in Massachusetts, something that Eric is leading with Larry Summers to ensure fairer voting and hopefully better results come election day. We talked about the technology and how it actually really shows its power within a distancing economy, provided that we do discuss we do look at the privacy issues. And on the environment, of course, we'll try not to repeat the mistake of the great financial crisis, and remember that the pandemic is teaching us more about the values of collaboration in sustainability as well. So as usual, my brain feels like it's been fried to a crisp, and I hope you got a lot of thoughtful nutrients out of our discussion. This has been another episode of Luohan on the Air. Big thank you to our wonderful guests, Professor Eric Maskin joining us from Boston in the US, Nobel laureate, of course, in economics, and from Hangzhou, our very own Professor Chen Long, Executive Director of Luohan Academy. Look forward to our next discussion. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Signing out.
Good talking
Thank
to
you, Lei.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Eric. Talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.